The archives of the Henrico County Courthouse were supposed to be empty. For over a century, the story was the same. The Great Fire of 1865 had breathed in the smoke of Virginia's documented shame and exhaled only ash. They told us the past was gone. They were wrong. In 1973, a wall collapsed. Behind the brick and the rot of a forgotten basement, workers found an iron strongbox, cold, heavy, and intentionally hidden. Inside were not official ledgers, but secrets, personal letters, frantic diary entries, and daguerreotypes from the 1840s. When the historian's lamp hit the first photograph, she didn't see a typical record of the enslaved. She saw a face. A small, haunting face with hair as pale as corn silk and eyes emerald green. Piercing, jewel-toned, and absolutely unmistakable. There were 23 of them. 23 children born into the darkness of the quarters, all carrying the same physical confession. All from one father. This isn't just a story of a hidden box. It's a story of a calculated, emerald-eyed ghost that haunted the James River. This is the truth they tried to burn. The discovery in 1973 was never meant to happen, appearing only after a structural failure during the routine renovation of the old Henrico County Clerk's office. For over a century, the public was led to believe that the fires of 1865 had turned every scrap of Virginia's documented sins into a mountain of cooling ash. Yet, as the dust settled from a collapsed basement wall, workers peered into a void that had been sealed since the height of the antebellum era. There, resting in the damp darkness, sat a heavy iron strongbox, its lid rusted shut but its presence undeniable. This was not a misplaced ledger or a forgotten piece of furniture, but a deliberate vault hidden by someone who knew the truth was too volatile to be left in the open. The box felt weighted with the gravity of a century's worth of silence, waiting for a single set of hands to break the seal. When the box was finally pried open, the contents revealed a haunting deviation from the sterile, cold nature of typical 19th century public records. Instead of property deeds or tax assessments, the interior was packed with intimate fragments of human lives, personal letters, tear-stained diary entries, and legal testimonies. These were the voices of the silenced, documents that were never intended to be heard by the public or preserved for the sake of history. They told a story so calculated and methodical that it bordered on the clinical, detailing a darkness that had been scrubbed from the official narrative of the state. It became clear that this was a private archive of shame, curated by someone who possessed a conscience but lacked the courage to speak. Every page turned was a step deeper into a labyrinth of systematic abuse that had been hidden behind the courthouse's brick and mortar. The most striking artifacts within the iron box were the daguerreotypes, early photographs that captured the likenesses of children who, by all accounts, should not have existed. As the historian wiped away the grime of decades, the flickering silver plates revealed 23 distinct faces, each one more perplexing than the last. These children were dressed in the rough, coarse fabrics typical of the enslaved quarters, yet their physical features told a radically different story of origin. They possessed a delicate, European refinement that looked as if it had been lifted directly from a portrait gallery in a London or Richmond manor. The contrast between their status as property and their aristocratic appearance was a jarring, visual paradox that demanded an explanation. These images were more than just portraits. They were biological evidence of a secret that the Virginia elite had spent generations trying to bury. Among the striking features of these children, it was their eyes that immediately seized the historian's attention and refused to let go. Across the 23 photographs, every single child stared back at the camera with eyes that were described in the notes as a piercing, emerald green. This was not a common shade of hazel or a pale gray, but a vibrant jewel-toned green that was as unmistakable as a fingerprint, accompanied by hair that ranged from pale blonde to striking gold. These children bore a familial resemblance, so strong it felt like a recurring ghost. The emerald eyes acted as a silent, unwavering confession, a genetic brand that linked every child to a single, powerful source of paternity. It was a trait so specific that it bypassed the need for DNA testing, serving as a permanent mark of the man who had sired them. The final layer of the discovery was the meticulous nature of the documentation that accompanied each haunting photograph and personal testimony. Beside every image, a careful, elegant script recorded the names of the mothers, the dates of birth, and the specific plantations where these children were born. A single, recurring word appeared in the margins of almost every entry, a possessive pronoun that pointed toward a singular, terrifying truth. The records spanned a period of 5 years, showing a geographical spread that proved this was not an isolated incident, but a cross-county campaign of exploitation. By cross-referencing these names with land deeds and birth registries, the historian confirmed that every detail was terrifyingly real and undeniably accurate. The iron box had preserved a map of human suffering, proving that even the most carefully hidden secrets eventually find a way to step into the light. The visual reality of the emerald eyes was a biological anomaly that shattered the expected order of the Virginia plantations. In a world where the line between master and property was meant to be as clear as a border, these children were living, breathing blurrings of that boundary. The mothers, women with skin deepened by the sun and ancestors from distant shores, looked upon their infants with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. They saw a vibrancy in those green irises that mirrored the lush tobacco fields, yet the color was a death sentence for any hope of privacy or denial. It was a hue so rare and so specific that it functioned as a lighthouse, signaling a presence that was never supposed to be acknowledged in the quarters. Every time a child opened their eyes in the dim light of a cabin, the room was filled with a truth that no amount of shadow could hide. The children's hair added another layer to the haunting visual narrative, falling in soft waves of blonde that caught the morning light like spun silk. While many children born into the system of slavery were of mixed heritage, the consistency of this specific aesthetic was what truly unnerved the overseers and the neighbors alike. This was not the gradual lightening of a lineage, it was a sudden, bold intrusion of European aristocracy into the rough, hewn world of the enslaved. The fine, pale strands were often tied back or hidden under caps, but they remained a constant reminder of a bloodline that was asserting itself against the will of the law. To the other enslaved families, these children looked like porcelain dolls mistakenly left in the dirt, fragile in appearance, but heavy with the weight of their own origin. They were walking paradoxes, their very bodies serving as a canvas for a crime that the local gentry had collectively agreed to ignore. As these children grew, the Emerald Eyes became a recognizable brand across the James River, a mark that distinguished them from every other soul on the landscape. It was said that a traveler could spot one of Blackwell's children from across a crowded market or a distant field, simply by the way the light hit their faces. This visibility was a curse for the mothers, who had to endure the silent accusations of their own communities and the predatory gaze of the white families. The eyes were not just a color, they were a persistent, unblinking testimony that demanded to be reconciled with the surrounding reality of chains and labor. There was no escaping the gaze of these children, which seemed to hold an ancient, knowing sorrow that far exceeded their tender years. They were the physical manifestation of a secret that had grown too large for its container, spilling out into the world with a clarity that was impossible to suppress. The social impact of this visual consistency was a slow poisoning of the domestic peace within the great manor houses of Henrico and Chesterfield counties. White mistresses looked at these children and saw the betrayal of their husbands and sons mirrored in the emerald depths of a toddler's stare. The eyes were a constant, silent confrontation in the kitchen, in the laundry, and in the yards, making it impossible to pretend that the peculiar institution was a tidy or manageable affair. Every child with those green eyes was a crack in the carefully maintained facade of Southern chivalry and domestic order. They represented a leak in the system, a genetic spill that could not be cleaned up or painted over with the brush of social status. Because the children were property, they could not be sent away easily, forcing the perpetrators to live among the evidence of their own moral decay day after day. Ultimately, the emerald eyes and blonde hair served as a haunting biological ledger that recorded the movements of a predator with more accuracy than any written document. In a time before forensic science, the sheer repetition of these traits across 23 different mothers provided a level of proof that was statistically undeniable. The children were a map of Jonathan Blackwell's path through the county, marking every dinner party, hunting trip, and business meeting with a subsequent birth 9 months later. They were the silent witnesses who didn't need to speak a word to tell the story of what had happened behind locked doors and in the quiet of the curing barns. The emerald eyes were a light that stayed on long after the sun went down, illuminating a systematic horror that was meant to remain in the dark. This was the legacy of the children. They were the living archives of a truth that Virginia was not yet brave enough to name. The systematic pattern of the births was not a series of random tragedies, but a cold, chronological map of a predator's movements across the Virginia landscape. Between 1839 and 1844, the frequency of these emerald-eyed infants increased with a rhythmic precision that suggested a deliberate and unchecked routine of violation. Each new arrival at a different plantation served as a timestamp, marking where Jonathan Blackwell had been exactly 9 months prior to the child's first cry. From the tobacco fields of Fairview to the riverbanks of Riverside, the geography of the county became a grid of documented evidence that no one dared to track. It was a trail of breadcrumbs left in the form of human lives, stretching across the county lines of Henrico and Chesterfield with terrifying consistency. The sheer scale of the pattern turned a private horror into a public secret that hung over the entire region like a suffocating fog. At the center of this expanding web sat Jonathan Blackwell, a man whose lack of responsibility gave him the freedom to haunt the properties of his neighbors. As the second son of a powerful dynasty, he moved through the social circles of the Virginia elite with a level of access that was never questioned or restricted. He was a frequent guest at barbecues, hunting trips, and formal dinners, using these invitations as a pretext to scout the corridors of neighboring manor houses. While the men discussed politics and crop yields over brandy, Jonathan was often found wandering the grounds or lingering near the service wings where the enslaved women worked. His presence was a quiet, looming threat that the women recognized long before the plantation owners began to notice the physical results of his visits. He operated with the confidence of a man who knew the law was a shield for his actions and a silencer for his victims. The mechanics of his predation were as consistent as the biological traits he left behind, often involving the calculated isolation of women in vulnerable positions. He did not seek out the anonymous crowds of the fields, but targeted those whose duties brought them into the house or the quiet outbuildings, whether it was a locked pantry at Meadowbrook or a curing barn at Cedar Hill. The locations were chosen for their privacy and the power dynamic they enforced. He used a combination of physical intimidation and the whispered threat of the lash to ensure that his victims understood the high cost of resistance. The mothers later recounted a chillingly similar sequence of events: the smell of his whiskey, the sudden grip on an arm, and the calm command to remain silent. It was a refined system of terror that relied on the absolute powerlessness of the women to protect their own bodies from his whims. This methodical exploitation created a network of shared trauma among the mothers, who began to recognize the signs of his passage in the faces of each other's children. When a woman from Willow Creek traveled to a neighboring farm, she did not need to ask who had fathered the infant with the striking green eyes. The recognition was instant and visceral, a silent bond formed by the same man's shadow falling over their lives at different times. They began to realize that they were not alone in their suffering, but part of a larger, horrific experiment in power and impunity conducted by a single individual. The pattern became a language of its own, spoken in the glances exchanged between plantations as the number of emerald-eyed children climbed toward 23. This was not the work of a man losing control, but the behavior of a man who felt entirely entitled to the world he inhabited. As the years progressed, the accumulation of these births forced a confrontation with the reality of what was happening under the surface of polite society. The evidence was no longer a whisper or a rumor. It was a physical presence that could be counted and verified by anyone with the courage to look. 23 children served as 23 separate counts of an indictment that the Virginia legal system refused to acknowledge or prosecute. The pattern proved that the abuse was not an isolated lapse in judgment, but a sustained and predatory lifestyle that thrived on the protection of the Blackwell name. Even as the evidence grew undeniable, the social and legal structures of the time worked in tandem to ensure the pattern could continue without interruption. The systematic nature of the crimes was ultimately the most damning revelation, showing that the monster was not just the man, but the system that allowed him to exist. The legal silence surrounding the emerald-eyed children was not a failure of the law, but rather a perfect execution of its design within the antebellum South. Under the statutes of Virginia in the 1840s, the concept of justice was a luxury reserved strictly for those whom the state recognized as human beings. For the mothers of these children, the law was a cold, impenetrable wall that offered no sanctuary for their bodies and no recognition of their pain. Enslaved women were classified as chattel, a legal status that reduced them to the level of livestock or farming equipment in the eyes of the court. Because property cannot be a victim of a crime, the very act of violation was legally invisible, a non-event that left no trace in the journals of the local sheriff. The silence was institutionalized, ensuring that the screams heard in the locked rooms of the Blackwell estate remained outside the reach of the gavel. William Carter's attempt to challenge this silence revealed the profound moral vacuum that existed at the heart of the Virginia legal and social hierarchy. As an educated man of standing, Carter initially believed that the sheer weight of the evidence would force a crack in the wall of indifference. He spent months documenting the births, tracking the dates, and listening to the harrowing testimonies of the women who bore the emerald-eyed proof. However, when he presented his findings, he discovered that truth had no currency in a system built on the absolute preservation of white male supremacy. The legal experts and fellow planters he approached did not argue the facts of the cases. They simply dismissed the relevance of the victims themselves. Their refusal to act was a calculated choice to protect the social order over the basic principles of human decency and moral accountability. The confrontation between Carter and Edmund Blackwell served as a grim reminder that the power of a name often outweighed the power of the truth. When presented with the undeniable pattern of his son's predatory behavior, the elder Blackwell did not respond with shame, but with a chilling and defensive display of authority. He understood that as long as the law defined the mothers as property, his son was technically innocent of any crime that the state could prosecute. Edmund's threat to destroy Carter's reputation was not a bluff, but a statement of the absolute control the Blackwell family exerted over the county's social and economic life. In this world, an accusation against a white man made by or on behalf of the enslaved was viewed as a form of social treason. The preservation of the Blackwell legacy was deemed more important than the lives of 23 children or the dignity of the women who bore them. This legal vacuum created an environment where Jonathan Blackwell could operate with a sense of total impunity, knowing his path was cleared by the very statutes of the state. He did not have to hide his actions behind elaborate lies or alibis, because he knew that the only witnesses to his crimes were legally barred from testifying. A black woman's voice carried no weight in a courtroom, and her word could never be used to impeach the character of a white gentleman, no matter how depraved his actions. This reality turned the courthouse into a fortress for the predator rather than a refuge for the prey, reinforcing the idea that some men were entirely above the reach of morality. The law served as a silencer, muting the cries of the quarters so that the polite conversations in the drawing rooms could continue without interruption. The systematic abuse was not just a personal failing of one man, but a collaborative effort of a society that refused to see. Ultimately, the silence of the law in 1840 created a debt of truth that would take over a century to be paid in full by the discovery of the iron box. By denying the women a voice and the children a father, the state of Virginia inadvertently created a secret history that burned more brightly because it was suppressed. The legal documents of the era are filled with the transactions of tobacco and land, yet they are hauntingly empty of the human cost required to maintain those fortunes. This void in the official record is what made the hidden journals and photographs found in 1973 so explosive and necessary for the modern world. The silence was finally broken not by a judge or a jury, but by the persistent survival of the evidence itself, which waited in the dark for the law to change. The emerald eyes remain a haunting reminder that while the law can be silenced for a time, the truth has a way of outliving those who try to bury it. The legacy of the children with emerald eyes moved from a place of deep shame in the quarters to a symbol of quiet, revolutionary defiance. As these 23 individuals grew, they became a living network of shared history that spanned across the boundaries of multiple Virginia plantations. They were the physical evidence of a story that the elite tried to erase, yet they walked the earth as undeniable proof of a systematic crime. The mothers, once isolated by their trauma, began to see their children not as marks of victimhood, but as a sacred charge to preserve a truth that the world refused to acknowledge. This shift in perspective was the beginning of a secret legacy, one that relied on the oral tradition to keep the names of the fathers and the dates of the violations alive. The children became the keepers of a flame that would eventually burn through the thickest walls of historical revisionism and courthouse silence. The secret meetings at Mount Zion Church became the crucible where this legacy was forged into a weapon of memory and spiritual survival. Under the watchful eye of Reverend Isaiah Grant, the mothers gathered not just to pray, but to ensure that their children knew exactly who they were and where they came from. These Sunday afternoons were a rare sanctuary where the emerald-eyed children could look at one another and realize they were part of a larger, albeit tragic, family. They were taught that their features were not a source of embarrassment, but a biological record that linked them to a truth greater than their status as property. The church pews held a congregation of witnesses who were preparing for a future they might never see, but one they were determined to influence. By naming the father in the safety of the sanctuary, they were stripping Jonathan Blackwell of the anonymity that the law had so carefully provided him. As the Civil War loomed and eventually tore through the heart of Virginia, the fate of the 23 children became a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Some were sold further south, scattering the emerald-eyed lineage across the continent, while others remained close to the land that had witnessed their births. Despite the chaos of the conflict and the eventual collapse of the institution of slavery, the internal map of their heritage remained remarkably intact. They carried the stories of the locked rooms and the iron box with them, passing the narrative down through generations like a hidden heirloom. The Emerald Blackwells, as some came to be known in hushed tones, represented a branch of the family tree that was never invited to the manor, but could never be pruned away. Their survival was a form of revenge against a system that had tried to categorize them as mere inanimate objects of trade. The eventual discovery of the iron strongbox in 1973 served as the ultimate vindication for the generations who had kept the secret in the dark. When the historian at the University of Virginia finally connected the photographs to the oral histories, the silence of the past was finally shattered by the roar of the truth. The meticulous records kept by William Carter and the mothers proved that the memory of the oppressed is often more accurate than the official archives of the powerful. The legacy was no longer a matter of whispers or rumors. It was a documented reality that forced a modern reckoning with the depths of antebellum depravity. The emerald eyes staring from the daguerreotypes finally found an audience that was willing to listen, to believe, and to record their names with the dignity they were always denied. This moment of revelation was the culmination of over a century of patient waiting by a truth that refused to stay buried. Today, the legacy of the emerald-eyed children stands as a powerful reminder of the resilience of truth in the face of systematic and institutionalized suppression. It serves as a haunting case study in how the biological and the historical can intersect to reveal the hidden fractures of a nation's foundational myths. The 23 children are no longer just a footnote in a county ledger, but central figures in a narrative of survival, motherhood, and the quest for justice. Their story challenges us to look behind the official walls of history to find the iron boxes and the sealed rooms where the real accounts are hidden. The emerald eyes remain a vibrant and unblinking symbol of a past that is never truly gone, but merely waiting for the right moment to be seen. By speaking their story, we ensure that the silence of the 1840s never has the final word on their lives or their worth.